One moment was all it took. Just seconds after Keir Starmer's car pulled up outside the gates of Parliament, the air in Westminster exploded with noise. But it wasn't applause. It wasn't the sound of celebration. It was anger. It was rejection. The Labour leader, the man who dreams of becoming Britain's next Prime Minister, was swallowed by a storm of boos so loud they seemed to rattle the ancient walls of Westminster itself. And with every chant, one word cut deeper than any headline, any policy failure, any opponent's attack. That word was traitor. The scene unfolded with the kind of raw intensity that no political strategist can prepare for. Protesters lined Parliament Square, their chants sharp, their anger impossible to ignore. This was not the usual background noise of politics. This was not a handful of hecklers easily dismissed. What Starmer walked into was a furious crowd determined to brand him as a man who had betrayed his own people. Placards were raised, high voices pierced the London evening, and with each chant the word traitor echoed across the very heart of British democracy. The humiliation began before Starmer even set foot on the ground. As his car rolled into sight, the boos came fast, sharp, unmistakable. Like warning sirens, they grew louder, more vicious, more personal. By the time the Labour leader stepped out and began his walk toward Parliament, the hostility was overwhelming. Starmer, jaw clenched, eyes fixed forward, tried to project calm authority, but no steady stride could mask what the cameras had already captured. The crowd wasn't just shouting at a politician, they were condemning a leader. What made this moment so dangerous was not only the noise, but the symbolism. These weren't just random agitators or lifelong Conservative voters looking to stir trouble. Many in that crowd were Labour's own. They were people who once knocked on doors, handed out leaflets, and defended the party in rain-soaked campaigns. Supporters turned critics, loyalists turned protesters, and now, instead of carrying Labour banners, they carried signs declaring betrayal, with messages painted in bold, "Not in our name." Inside Labour circles, such a confrontation had long been feared. The earlier boos in Southport had been brushed off as isolated anger, but tonight proved otherwise. This wasn't an accident, this wasn't fringe discontent. It was the eruption of something that had been building for months, maybe even years. Starmer's leadership, built carefully on caution, compromise, and calculated moderation, was now cracking under the pressure of disillusionment. On Brexit, he had blurred the lines, leaving both Remainers and Leavers dissatisfied. On Gaza, his refusal to call for a ceasefire had struck deep at the party's moral conscience. And to his critics, his gestures toward aligning with Trump's foreign policy were not signs of pragmatism, but of surrender. Each of these choices had carved away at Labour's soul, and tonight outside Westminster, those wounds bled openly. The chants were relentless. They weren't just noise, they were a verdict. Each repetition of traitor became a hammer blow to Starmer's carefully crafted image of composure and authority. Every step he took toward the entrance was shadowed by the rising fury behind him. Cameras rolled, phones captured every second, and within minutes, the footage was everywhere. Viral, inescapable. A humiliation now burned permanently into the memory of British politics. The symbolism could not be ignored. The gates of Parliament, the most visible stage in the country, had become the backdrop for the collapse of trust. Starmer wasn't battling his political opponents on the right. He wasn't sparring with the government in debates. He was being rejected by the very people his party was supposed to represent. This was not just politics as usual. This was something darker, something more dangerous. The image of a leader booed by his own supporters, branded a traitor at the very doorstep of power. And in politics, perception is everything. No speech, no press release, no spin can erase the sound of betrayal echoing through Westminster. Inside Parliament, the atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating. Starmer's aides shuffled papers, whispered hurried notes, and tried to maintain the illusion of business as usual. But the truth was impossible to ignore. Every person in that room had heard it. Every person had seen it. The sound of thousands of voices branding their leader a traitor was still ringing in their ears. It didn't matter how many policy briefings were prepared, or how carefully worded tomorrow's press release might be. The images outside had already written the headline for them. Keir Starmer, the man who promised calm authority, had been reduced to silence under the weight of his own supporters' fury. And silence in politics is not strength, it is weakness. A vacuum that is filled by the voices of opponents, critics, and disillusioned allies alike. The danger for Starmer was not simply the humiliation of one night, but what that night represented. The fractures inside Labour's base, long hidden behind the appearance of unity, had burst wide open. For months, murmurs of frustration had grown louder in community halls, in union meetings, in online forums where once loyal Labour members vented their anger. They complained that the party no longer stood for working-class values, that its leadership no longer reflected the voice of ordinary people. Starmer's strategy of cautious moderation, designed to make Labour look safe and electable, was now backfiring. To many, it didn't look like stability, it looked like weakness. And weakness, once exposed in politics, spreads quickly and mercilessly. Journalists sensed blood in the water. Within minutes, the footage of Starmer's stiff walk through a sea of boos was broadcast across every news channel, dissected by commentators eager to frame the moment as a turning point. Some painted it as a humiliating reminder that the Labour leader was losing touch with his own voters. Others went further, suggesting that it could mark the beginning of a leadership crisis. And while Starmer's aides tried to dismiss the chants as the work of a small but vocal group, the truth was far more damaging. These weren't just random hecklers, these were the people Labour depended on. The base, the foot soldiers, the campaigners who turned votes into victories. If even they were booing him, then what did that say about his grip on the country? But the protest was not confined to Westminster. Within hours, clips flooded social media. Twitter feeds blazed with hashtags. TikTok videos layered the footage with captions. And Facebook groups shared headlines declaring Labour betrayed. The word traitor spread like wildfire, repeated endlessly, attaching itself to Starmer's name. In the brutal world of online politics, perception moves faster than reality. A protest that lasted minutes outside Parliament was now stretched into hours, days, weeks of replayed humiliation. Every scroll of the phone became a reminder that the Labour leader had been booed by his own supporters on the steps of power. And with every share, every retweet, every mocking caption, the story grew larger than the protest itself. The crowd outside Westminster may have numbered only in the hundreds, but online, it had multiplied into millions. A national humiliation unfolding in real time. By nightfall, news outlets across the country had plastered the footage on their websites. By morning, it dominated every front page. Labour leader booed Asdad. Protesters chant traitor at Parliament. The imagery was unforgiving. Starmer's face set in stone, his stride stiff, the crowd behind him in open revolt. A politician cannot choose which images define them, and for Starmer, this one was already cemented. Inside Labour, the whispers turned sharper. MPs, who had long avoided direct criticism, began to exchange nervous messages. Some questioned whether Starmer still had the authority to lead the party into the next election. A few even dared to suggest that the time for new leadership was approaching. Potential successors' names were muttered in hushed tones, proof that the once solid wall around Starmer's position was beginning to crack. It was no longer just political opponents piling on. It was Labour MPs, party activists, and grassroots supporters who were beginning to see him not as a leader, but as a liability. And this is where the protest revealed its true power. It wasn't just about the chants. It was about the symbolism of betrayal being voiced at the gates of British democracy, in front of cameras, in front of the nation. Parliament had become the stage for a public revolt, and Starmer had been cast not as the leader, but as the villain of his own story. Every chant, every sign, every viral clip reinforced the same brutal truth. His leadership was no longer untouchable. Once the label of traitor sticks to a politician, it is almost impossible to scrape off. And for Starmer, that word was now etched into the narrative of his career. By the next morning, it was clear that the protest outside Westminster was not going to fade quietly into memory. What had begun as a furious crowd at the gates of Parliament was spreading across the nation like fire catching dry grass. Reports began flooding in of demonstrations being planned in cities from Manchester to Liverpool, from Birmingham to Glasgow. The anger had moved beyond London. It was no longer confined to a single square or a single night. It had become a rallying cry, a movement, and one word stood at its core: traitor. Grassroots activists, once the lifeblood of Labour campaigns, were now openly mobilising against their own leader. Social media groups that had spent months simmering with frustration suddenly exploded with new members, new plans, and new energy. The Westminster protest had given them proof that they were not alone. They had seen their anger reflected back at them in the chants of hundreds, and now they were determined to amplify it until the entire country could not ignore their message. Inside Labour, panic was beginning to take hold. Private WhatsApp groups buzzed with messages from MPs, many of whom had woken up to find their phones flooded with questions from constituents. Why had their leader been booed? Why were Labour's own supporters turning against him? And most importantly, what did it mean for the party's future? For some MPs, the humiliation was not just embarrassing, it was dangerous. They knew that in the weeks and months ahead, They would have to face voters at local meetings, on television interviews, and at campaign doorsteps. And if the only image voters had in their minds was their leader being branded a traitor by his own base, those conversations would be brutal. Even loyal MPs were struggling to find the words to defend him. The protective shield that once surrounded Starmer was collapsing. Polling data arriving that same morning made the crisis even clearer. Internal surveys, rushed out overnight, revealed a dangerous shift. It wasn't just undecided voters wavering, it was Labour's own loyal base beginning to crumble. People who had called themselves lifelong supporters admitted that they no longer trusted Starmer. Some were already looking to alternatives, from the Liberal Democrats to Reform UK, while others confessed they were considering abstaining altogether. For a party hoping to seize power after years of Conservative chaos, this was nothing short of catastrophic. It wasn't just about numbers, it was about trust. And trust, once broken, rarely returns. The Conservatives wasted no time exploiting the moment. Tory MPs gleefully shared the footage online with mocking captions, painting Starmer as weak, disconnected, and despised by his own people. Ministers prepared sharp lines for Prime Minister's questions, ready to use the humiliation as a weapon inside the Commons chamber. They did not need to exaggerate or distort. The footage itself was enough. The chants, the boos, the look on Starmer's face as he walked stiffly past the crowd. It was all there, raw and undeniable. A gift to his opponents, handed to them by his own supporters. But it was not just the Conservatives who smelled blood. Inside Labour itself, the whispers of dissent were evolving into something more. Senior MPs, once loyal to the leadership, began testing the waters, dropping cautious criticisms in interviews, hinting at frustrations with Starmer's cautious strategy. Some warned that the party was drifting too far from its values. Others, speaking privately, admitted the unthinkable, that perhaps it was time to start considering alternatives. The protest had done more than humiliate Starmer. It had opened the floodgates. Once the word traitor was shouted outside Parliament, it was as if it gave permission for others to voice their own doubts, fears, and resentments. What had once been whispered in closed rooms was now being spoken aloud. A leader who had promised unity was instead watching his party splinter before his eyes, and the symbolism of it all could not be ignored. The protest had taken place at the very seat of British democracy, the most visible stage in the nation. In politics, moments like that do not just pass, they define. Every chant, every sign, every viral clip was now evidence of a deeper truth. Keir Starmer's leadership was no longer secure. His authority was no longer untouchable. His grip on the party and on the country's trust was slipping, and with every passing hour, the word traitor was spreading further into the bloodstream of British politics. By midday, the story had fully consumed the political landscape. Every major newspaper splashed the same image across its front page. Keir Starmer, walking stiffly through the gates of Parliament, head down, jaw tight, while behind him a furious crowd branded him a traitor. Television anchors replayed the footage on loop, dissecting every frame as though it were evidence in a trial. The tightening of his jaw, the refusal to glance at the protesters, the silence that stretched like a void, all of it was examined and declared damning. For a man who built his image on calm authority, the optics were catastrophic. Calm had been replaced by humiliation, authority by rejection. And in politics, once a narrative like that takes hold, it is almost impossible to rewrite. Inside Labour headquarters, the mood was bleak. Staffers scrolled endlessly through their phones, watching as hashtags demanding Starmer's resignation surged into the trending lists. Private group chats among MPs filled not with support, but with speculation. Some were already floating the names of possible successors. What had once been whispers of doubt was now an open question. Could Keir Starmer still lead Labour to victory, or had the word traitor fatally attached itself to his name? In community halls and union branches, the mood was no better. Grassroots activists who had carried Labour through decades of battles were now bitter, even angry. They no longer saw Starmer as their leader, but as a liability. A man who had drifted too far from the values they believed defined their movement. Across the country, the phrase was repeated again and again. He doesn't stand for us. The crisis was not only emotional, it was measurable. Overnight polling revealed the damage was not confined to perception. It was bleeding into numbers. Trust in Starmer had plunged. Voters who once looked to Labour as the party of hope now saw it as a party divided, led by a man who seemed more like a manager than a leader. Some were considering defecting to other parties. Others simply admitted they no longer knew if they could vote Labour at all. For the Conservatives, it was a gift. After years of their own chaos and scandals, they suddenly found themselves with a weapon powerful enough to shift the national narrative. They didn't have to manufacture an attack. The footage spoke for itself, and they wielded it ruthlessly. In the Commons, in the press, and online, they framed Starmer as a leader rejected by his own base, weak and unable to command respect even from the people he was supposed to represent. But perhaps the most dangerous blows were not coming from the outside, they were coming from within. Senior Labour figures began to sharpen their criticisms, some publicly, others through carefully timed leaks. Allies who once defended him with unwavering loyalty now offered only tepid support, while rivals began to test the ground for a challenge. The word leadership began to appear in conversations not about strength, but about succession. History has shown that once doubts about a leader's authority take hold inside their own party, they spread like wildfire. One protest had triggered not just a media storm, but a crisis of confidence inside Labour itself. Political analysts drew chilling comparisons to past leaders who had faced moments of public rejection from their own supporters, moments they never recovered from. They warned that once a label like traitor becomes attached to a name, it no longer functions as an insult but as an identity. It becomes shorthand for weakness, betrayal, and failure. And in the unforgiving world of politics, identities like that rarely fade. They calcify. They define. For Keir Starmer, the danger was not that the protest would be forgotten. The danger was that it would be remembered, replayed, and reinforced until it became inseparable from his name. By the time the sun set again over Westminster, one truth was unavoidable. This was not just a bad night for Keir Starmer. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. The protest at Parliament had transformed into a national humiliation, one that exposed fractures in Labour's base, emboldened his critics, and handed his opponents the most powerful weapon they could hope for. The chants of traitor were not fading. They were growing louder, echoing across the political landscape, threatening to define not just his leadership, but his legacy. What happened outside Parliament was not merely a protest, it was a verdict, and that verdict could follow him all the way to the next election, and perhaps even to the end of his leadership itself. As the days rolled on, it became clear that the Westminster protest was not a one-off event. It had become a turning point. What started as a storm outside Parliament began to spread like a chain reaction, reshaping the conversation across Britain. Protests were now being organised in dozens of cities, from London's financial heart to the industrial towns that had once been Labour's safest strongholds. Each demonstration carried the same chant, the same word that now hung like a shadow over Starmer's every move: traitor. And with every rally, every banner, every viral video clip, the image of a leader under siege grew stronger. It was no longer just about policy. It was about betrayal, about trust, about whether the man who wanted to be Prime Minister had already lost the very people he needed most. The media frenzy refused to die down. For every statement Labour HQ released, there were 10 headlines replaying the humiliation, 10 pundits dissecting what it meant, and 10 viral clips mocking the moment. Editors knew a political bloodsport when they saw one, and they had no intention of letting go. Newspapers printed side-by-side images of Starmer, one of him walking past the angry crowd, the other of signs declaring him a traitor. Broadcasters invited disillusioned Labour voters onto their shows to share their anger. Online, the narrative spread like wildfire, and Starmer's silence in the face of it only made the storm louder. In politics, silence is not strategy. It is surrender. And that silence was now filling with the voices of his critics. Inside Labour, the pressure was reaching boiling point. MPs who had once bitten their tongues now spoke openly about their fears. Some demanded that Starmer take a stronger stance, warning that his cautious, middle-ground strategy was killing the party's identity. Others whispered the word that had until now been taboo: challenge. Leadership challenge. It was no longer a distant possibility, but an active conversation. The protest had given permission for rebellion to grow, and that rebellion was spreading fast. Local party branches demanded emergency meetings. Union leaders expressed frustration that Labour had abandoned its moral compass. Activist groups coordinated online, calling for more demonstrations until Starmer either changed course or stepped aside. The Conservatives seized the moment with ruthless precision. They knew opportunity when they saw it. Ministers mocked Starmer in Parliament, repeating the chants back at him, framing him as a leader despised by his own side. Social media accounts amplified the humiliation, while Tory strategists briefed the press that Labour was collapsing under weak leadership. For the first time in years, it was not Conservative scandals dominating the news cycle, but Labour's crisis. And the more the footage of Starmer's humiliation spread, the more it distracted from the failures of the government. For the Conservatives, it was a political gift, wrapped in anger and delivered by Labour's own base. And yet, the greatest threat still lay within Labour itself. Once a leader is seen as vulnerable, once doubt takes hold, politics moves quickly, rivals smell opportunity, allies grow restless, supporters look for alternatives. The protest outside Westminster was more than a single night of fury. It was the spark that revealed just how fragile Starmer's grip on Labour had become. Each chant of traitor was not just an insult, it was a signal that his authority was crumbling, that his base was revolting, and that his opponents, both inside and outside his party, would not let him recover easily. The verdict was out, and the clock was ticking. By the end of the week, the protest outside Westminster had transformed into something much larger, a political reckoning. What had begun as a furious outburst of boos had grown into a national crisis threatening to consume Labour from the inside. In towns and cities across the country, fresh protests were breaking out, each one echoing the same chants, each one amplifying the same word: traitor. Starmer could not escape it. Whether he appeared on television, entered a meeting, or made a speech, the memory of that night loomed behind him like a shadow he could not shake. The chant had become a brand, and brands in politics are powerful. They stick, they spread, they define. Inside Labour headquarters, the atmosphere had shifted from unease to outright alarm. Senior figures whispered about timelines, about survival, about how long their leader could endure under the weight of such humiliation. Some still clung to loyalty, urging patience, insisting the storm would pass. But others saw the writing on the wall. They argued that the damage was not temporary, but permanent, that Starmer had been marked in the public mind as weak, disconnected, and untrustworthy. The question was no longer if Labour faced a leadership crisis. The question was when. And that shift in tone was deadly, because in politics, once a leader's authority is openly questioned, it rarely returns. In the corridors of Parliament, rivals began to move quietly but deliberately. Potential successors gauged support, floating their names in private conversations, testing the waters with allies. Some MPs who had kept their distance from dissent were now openly asking if Labour could survive an election with Starmer at the helm. A party that had once presented itself as unified, disciplined, and ready for government was beginning to fracture in plain sight. And every fracture was deepened by the memory of that single night, those single chants, the single word that had branded their leader. Meanwhile, public opinion continued to slide. Polling numbers showed a sharp decline in trust, not just among undecided voters, but among Labour's own core supporters. People who had campaigned tirelessly for the party in the past now said they no longer believed in its leadership. Some even admitted they would sit out the next election altogether. For Labour, a party desperate to regain power after years in opposition, this was catastrophic. Political parties can survive scandals, they can survive mistakes, but they cannot survive when their base loses faith. And that faith was crumbling fast. The Conservatives, sensing their chance, went for the jugular. In Parliament, Tory MPs mocked Starmer relentlessly, repeating the chants of traitor across the chamber, turning the humiliation into a weapon. On social media, they amplified the footage until it became impossible to avoid. Ministers framed Labour not as the party of hope, but as a party divided and led by a man despised by his own. For once, it was not Conservative chaos dominating the headlines, it was Labour's weakness. And that reversal in the political narrative was devastating. As the days stretched into nights, one truth grew clearer by the hour. The Westminster protest was not fading into history. It was rewriting it. It had transformed from an isolated incident into a defining moment, a turning point that could haunt Keir Starmer for the rest of his career. What had happened outside Parliament was no longer just about boos or chants. It was about trust shattered in public view. It was about betrayal made visible to the nation. And it was about whether a man branded a traitor by his own people could ever hope to lead them.